Today's lecture is an introduction to epistemology. Epistemology is the theory and philosophy of knowledge and studies what it is that we know. We're making a transition in this class from the philosophy of ethics to the philosophy of epistemology, where the big difference resides in the kinds of questions that are asked, right? Ethics asks questions about rightness and wrongness, whether or not certain actions are right or wrong, good or bad, and about how we ought to act and live. Epistemology asks questions about how we know things, whether, like, what knowledge is, and what kinds of things count as things that we do know. Up to this point in discussing ethics, we've pretty much just assumed that we actually know what kinds of things are right and what kinds of things are wrong, what kinds of things are moral and what kinds of things are immoral, and then discuss different theories about, what the best life is, or what we should do and how we should do it, what our obligations are, what's good and what's bad. But in epistemology, we're not going to take any of that for given. In epistemology, we ask questions about how we could possibly know any of these things. And in a way, there is this sort of foundational epistemology to ethics that makes ethics somewhat difficult to do sometimes, because there's always this good question of how do we know anything about ethics? How do we know what's good? How do we know what's right? Who gives us the authority, if anyone, to say, to proclaim that some actions are good and some actions are wrong? Why do we think that we know better than anyone else? Now, knowledge as a term in English is used in a number of different ways. Two sort of fundamental uses for the term, one of which encompasses sort of an entire body of information or knowledge. It's sort of a systematic organizing of a field of information into the things that we know about that field, right? So this is generally what we think of when we talk about like science. When you talk about science and you talk about scientific knowledge, you kind of mean one and the same thing, right? When you're talking about physics, you're talking about the things that we know about the physical world. When you're talking about biology, you're talking about the things that we know about living things, living organisms. This terminology differs in various ways, from our everyday use of the term know, where our everyday use of the term know is quite common. And when we use that term, we talk about somebody, we don't tend to say that somebody has knowledge, but we tend to say all the time, like, oh, he knows she's coming to the party, or, she knows her way home, right? Really basic things, right? He knows where he left his car. And these kinds of things, epistemology is ultimately concerned with both of these uses of the term knowledge or know, because epistemology is concerned both with our highly theoretical, abstract, systematic knowledge in this sort of larger sense, our knowledge of science and how we come to know it and how we come to believe these far-flung things both in philosophy and science, as well as our everyday uses of the term to know, and how it is that we come to know really basic things, like on the basis of our perceptions, right? Like being able to see things and hear things, and whether or not we can trust what other people say. Like, can you come to know something just because somebody told you? That's basically a form of epistemology called social epistemology, where we determine whether or not trust is enough to know something. Trusting in what someone said. One thing that should sort of be clear at the get-go is that knowledge is distinct from mere opinion or belief. And there's got to be some recognition of what it is that makes knowledge distinct from opinion. I mean, lots of people have lots of opinions, but the first thing you should ask about people's opinions is whether or not those opinions can be wrong. Of course they can, right? So currently people have opinions about whether or not certain COVID vaccines work. And, if they think that they don't, maybe they're going to be wrong. Other people have opinions about whether or not Donald Trump won the election. I'm pretty sure that they're wrong. Now, these people might claim that they know these things, right? They might claim things like, I know that Donald Trump beat Joe Biden and that it's all just a crock so far in that this election, the election was rigged, something like that, right? But however, we can understand these people's opinions as incorrect, whereas we would say that they don't actually have knowledge in these cases, right? The reasoning being that opinions have the possibility, beliefs have the possibility of being right or wrong, whereas knowledge, if you really know something, it can't be false. It couldn't turn out to not be correct. If you didn't know it, I mean, if it turned out to be incorrect, then you didn't know it in the first place because it was incorrect. Now, that might lead one to think, well, wait a minute. Okay, so does that just make knowledge just all of the true information that's out there? Is knowledge really just all of the facts, right? And you might think that. But there's another sort of issue with thinking that knowledge is just constituted by all of the facts, when we recognize that there are lots of facts that we ultimately just don't know. I mean, think about what we do in science, what physics does or what biology does. They do experiments to try and determine what things are facts. But before they figure out which things ultimately are facts, they don't know them, right? We don't know them as humans. So ultimately, knowledge plays this sort of middle ground between opinion and fact. It basically seems to constitute a place where we believe things and know that they're true and believe that they're true for good reasons. Now, there are a number of different ways that we can come to know things. Some listed here. There's perception. We can see or hear things. There's interpersonal communication. We can discuss things with people and thereby come to know what each other are talking about. Rational reflection. We can think about things. We can reason to conclusions. And intellectual intuition. We can seemingly come to know certain fundamental truths simply by understanding the way that things seem. Now, these ways of knowing pretty much break down into two different camps. And those two camps are a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. Each of these distinguished by the way in which these things are come to be known. First, let me lay out a helpful distinction. Sentences are the symbols that we use in language, and sentences express statements or propositions that are true or false. A true statement or proposition expresses a fact, but sometimes statements are false. Now, we can distinguish statements from sentences because the same statement or proposition can be used to make different, made, the same proposition can be expressed or stated using different sentences. This includes using sentences in different languages. So take these two sentences. The man came into the room, and into the room came the adult male human. These two sentences say the same thing using different words in different orders. They're different sentences, but they say the same thing. They express the same statement or proposition. Similarly, the sentence snow is white and the German sentence Schnee ist weiß both express that snow is white. They say the same thing in different languages. So the thing that they say is the proposition that snow is white. Now, knowledge, when it comes to knowledge, is of true statements or propositions, not of true sentences. So you want to be clear when you discuss knowing things. You don't know a sentence, you know what a sentence expresses, the statement or proposition that the sentence is supposed to say. Now, a priori knowledge is the kind of knowledge of statements which express facts that we know or are able to know without having to rely on our senses or observation. A priori truths are known by a priori methods. The a priori methods basically being rational reflection and intuition. A priori methods are basically ways of knowing that don't involve observing anything or perceiving anything. So, for example, things that we know a priori are truths such as 1 + 2 = 3, that every event has a cause, that bachelors are unmarried, that everything is identical with itself, and that a² + b² = c² for right triangles. Each a priori truth basically is the kind of thing that you know, that you can come to know without having to go out into the world and do any sort of investigation. A posteriori knowledge is of true statements that we come to find out about through like going out into the world and observing. We use our perceptual capacities and come to find out certain things are true and other things are false. This is when we come to find out the truths, we have a posteriori knowledge. To know the facts that we come to have in this a posteriori way, those facts must affect us in some way. We must be out in the world as receivers, and these facts kind of, impinge on our senses or on our technology that is made for detecting these things. We come to recognize these facts through some form of observation. So, for example, certain a posteriori facts, some a posteriori knowledge that we have is that water is H2O, that cats are mammals, that I ate breakfast today, that Donald Trump's hair is orange, etc. As should be clear by this point, knowing something, knowledge in general, is very closely related to the notion of truth. Being able to know something and that thing being true are importantly related. This is ultimately because you can't know what's false. But there are different ways that things can be false, right? So take the sentence, it's raining, and it's not raining, that whole sentence. Now, do you know that this sentence is false? If you do, how? Have you gone out and checked the weather? Of course not. You needn't check the weather to know that the sentence, it is raining and it is not raining, is false. Sometimes we can know that a sentence is true or false merely by understanding what it says, and that sentence simply contradicts itself. This kind of knowledge, this kind of being able to know that a sentence is true or false merely by understanding it, is a form of a priori knowledge. And these kinds of sentences are called analytic. Analytic sentences are true or false based solely on what they mean. An analytically true sentence is something like, all bachelors are unmarried. This is because the word bachelor simply means unmarried male. Similarly, an analytically false sentence is the sentence, 1 dozen cookies is 11 cookies, because the phrase 1 dozen means 12. Statements that we can know simply by understanding the sentences that express them can be contrasted with ones that don't work this way. There are synthetic sentences that are to be contrasted with analytic sentences that state facts or falsehoods that we must verify using a posteriori methods, where a posteriori methods involve observation or our senses. For example, the Earth is spherical. That couldn't have been known simply by thinking rational reflection. Grandma's house is over the river and through the woods. You need to go find out, right? You can't just say and know without checking. Similarly, that the President of the United States is not Donald Trump. That is a statement of either is true or false, depending on how the world is, and you can't simply come to know this by understanding the meaning of the sentence. Now, statements can be true in two different kinds of ways. they can be necessarily true or contingently true. A necessarily true statement is the kind of statement that's ultimately true no matter what. These statements reflect facts that are immutable, unchangeable, or unchanging. These things are things that will never be different or couldn't be different. And you've got to be really careful here. There's a difference between words and facts. Of course, for example, the sentence 2 + 2 = 4, it expresses in English a necessary fact. 2 and 2 could never be anything other than 4. However, there could always be a different sentence, or the sentence 2 + 2 = 4 could be used to express some other thing. So we need to be careful here that we're discussing facts that are necessary rather than, or contingent, rather than sentences. Other necessarily true statements are things like every cause has an effect, that I am the same person as me, right? That it's morally wrong to cause unnecessary harm to others, etc. Contingent truths or statements state contingent matters of fact. These contingent facts basically are facts that could have been otherwise. They're your everyday run-of-the-mill facts that you find out all the time when you can imagine scenarios in which things might have worked out differently. Contingent examples are like that my hair is brown, or that my dog is named Joey, or that the harvest moon of this year was on September 20th, 2021, or that Donald Trump was elected president in 2016. These kinds of things could have been different if things were different. More often than not, the things that we come to know are contingent. You see something happen, it could have been different than it is. But sometimes we come to find out things that are necessary as well, things like mathematical truths or truths about the nature of reality. Can you imagine anything that you know that is necessary, but that you found out through experience? There are many ultimately controversial examples here, and some people tend to think of these things as important, and others tend to think of them as unimportant. Things like that water is H2O, that cats are mammals, etc. And we'll discuss these issues further as the class goes on. Now, just to recap this sort of introduction to epistemology, we've got three sets of distinctions now. First, knowledge can come in a priori and a posteriori forms, depending on the methods that are used to procure that knowledge. Sentences can be true or false in an analytic or a synthetic way. Sentences that are analytically true are true in virtue of what they mean, and sentences that are synthetic are true because of some way that the world is. Truths can also be necessary or contingent. A necessary truth is something that is true no matter what, and a contingent truth is something that is true but could have been false, could have been some other way. Moving on now, there are a number of ways that we come to know things. There are methods of investigation into the world, methods of coming to know. And science is generally seen as our best arena for thinking about or coming to know what we know in the big sense, meaning like our organized big body of knowledge. Now, what exactly does science do, and how does science come to know things? Well, there are two methods, the method of induction and the method of abduction. Now, more often than not, when it comes to doing science, we want to make what are called generalizations. We want to come to know about things in general and be able to make claims of the sort that encompass everything. We want to say things like every subatomic particle works like this, or every living creature has this kind of system, circulatory system, something like that, right? But in order to do that, we have to come to that knowledge in a sort of piecemeal way. The way that science operates is by observing things and then slowly coming to conclusions. We observe particular matters of fact, and then from those particular observations, we try to generalize. We try to expand on them. So you might think, like, here's an example. Suppose I go out into the world and I see a white swan, and then I see another white swan as I keep I'm studying swans. I'm going to all these ponds. I ultimately see 100 white swans in a row. I might generalize, well, okay, all swans are white, right? Because I've seen 100 of them, I can make this hypothesis, all swans are white. Now, do I know this? Now, the inductive method, or induction itself, is basically the method that we follow when we're moving from the things that we know through observation, particular facts, to these general facts, or these general statements. We try to confirm the general facts by experiencing instances, doing experiments, making observations of particular facts. So, my hypothesis that all swans are white is going to ultimately be, is going to fail if I run into a black swan. Here, my inductive procedure would ultimately have been fouled up, and I can no longer conclude that all swans are white if I run into a black swan. This ultimately is exactly what happened because people hadn't, been to Australia where there are black swans for a long time. So people thought for a really long time that all swans were white, and then they found a black one. Oh, turns out that's wrong. Abduction is another form of reasoning that we use in scientific theory. We also use it in philosophy, but it's called the appeal to the best explanation. Generally, when we make abductive inferences, these are the kinds of inferences that we make on the basis of lots of evidence, when we come to recognize that the evidence coheres in a certain way. For example, the fact that the Earth revolves around the sun is an example of a kind of abductive inference that was made early on before everyone could sort of see how clear it was that everything, that the sun was at the center of the solar system. People thought, okay, well, if the Earth is at the center of the solar system, then all of the heavenly bodies make these really crazy movements at different times of year. But if we put the sun at the center of the solar system, then all of the movements of all these heavenly bodies make a lot more sense. Because ultimately they just circle around the sun. For instance, Galileo believed that the sun was at the center of the universe, not the Earth, which, he was wrong about that. It's not the center of the universe, but, and why did he think that? Well, because there's lots of evidence for heliocentrism and lots of evidence against geocentrism. The way that the stars move, the retrograde of the planets, ultimately the elegance of the model, that is that the planets rotate around the sun, is much more convincing than the inelegance of the model where the sun and planets rotate around the Earth and have to do these very strange loop-de-loops. Now, abduction is also a method that we use for judging philosophical theories. More often than not, philosophical theories are very difficult to observe to be true. In fact, probably none of them are. And so usually we take a confluence of evidence that grows and grows and grows, and then that helps us to determine whether or not some philosophical theory is ultimately true. We appeal to the best explanation, given all of the knowledge that we have, in order to settle what we think is likely the truth, even if we're unable to know it with certainty. In a way, this takes in inductive methods where we do lots of little bits of observation, and then we try to put together all of the general things that we've come to know that way, and then put all of those together and see how well they cohere with one another in order to come up with a large theory via abduction. Now, the other methods for coming to know things tend to be through introspection and reason. There's some kinds of knowledge that we come to learn not by way of perceptual observation, but by way of introspection or by way of reasoning about how things are. So first, is it possible for you to know that your dog is in pain? Well, of course, you can see your dog yelp and whimper. You can hear him. You can see that he's maybe attending to his injured leg. But can you really know if he is feeling pain? What about your friend, right? If your friend is crying out, do you know that they're in pain? What if they're faking it? Now, of course, usually you can trust your dog or your friend, but there are some kinds of things that you really are only able to know by introspection. For example, when your friend is in pain, you might know that they're in pain by seeing, but you can't feel their pain. You don't know how their pain feels. And this happens in lots of different cases, ultimately. There are things that you can come to know through observation, but that other people only know in a much more intimate or different way, and the same vice versa, right? So for example, whether or not you're in pain, whether or not you're hot or cold or hungry or itchy or tired or happy or sad, these are kinds of things that you could only really come to know by introspecting, by focusing in on your own internal experience. And these kinds of states, usually, they're accompanied by external responses, and those responses can, of course, sometimes be faked, but for the most part, people that are observing these responses can kind of come to know maybe what your internal state is, but they can't come to know what that internal state is like because they can't feel it in this sort of intimate way that only you can feel it. So introspection allows you to have a certain kind of knowledge that oftentimes, for the most part, other people can't have. They can only have it in their own case, from their own perspective, with respect to their own internal feelings or pains or whatever. Finally, some things are simply known by reasoning because, and these things, for the most part, can't be known through observation or introspection. Math is pretty much the best example here. How do we know that 1 + 1 = 2 and always will, be that way? It's not as if it's simply because we see, one thing and then another thing, and then we recognize, oh, that's two things. It's not a generalization. It's not an inductive generalization from seeing, two things over and over and over again. This couldn't be the case because if that were the case, then we wouldn't be able to do math with extremely large numbers where we run out of objects that we can sort of look at and count, right? Think about huge numbers. When we add them together, they create another huge number, and that's always going to be true. There's no way around that. But how do we come to know that that's true? Well, we come to know it by reasoning, by doing mathematics, by using the ability that we have to reason, knowing how math works, knowing how numbers operate, knowing how the plus function and the equals function operate, and that allows us to come to know certain kinds of things just on the basis of thinking, just on the basis of reasoning. There are a number of things that seem to be known merely because we are able to reason about them. So take, for example, that every event has a cause. Now, why should you think that that's true? I mean, it seems plausible that every event that's ever existed has been caused by some other previous event. But we come to know this not because we've observed this fact. In fact, we simply couldn't have observed this fact. We might come to generalize to this fact on the basis of induction. But in a way, this kind of reasoning seems to be more conceptual. What it is for something to be an event is for it to be something that was caused. In a way, this kind of knowledge and coming to reflect on this kind of knowledge and come to see that these kinds of things are true is very similar to coming to know that ultimately everything is self-identical, right? Everything is just what it is. that happiness is is a good thing, right? That, this is the kind of thing that you come to know simply by experiencing it. That I am here right now, right? That you can't know that by, I mean, you might know a little bit by introspection, but for the most part, it's something that you can know simply on the basis of understanding the conceptual thinking behind what these words mean, or that all bachelors are male. There are two classical philosophical viewpoints that take different stances on these methods for knowing. Empiricism is the classical philosophical epistemological theory that all real knowledge comes by way of the senses through observation. The empiricist says that we don't know anything except what we observe and what we glean on the basis of observation. Ultimately, the empiricist will deny certain kinds of things as true knowledge. Rationalism, on the other hand, says that some kinds of knowledge come through means other than the senses. For example, they think that we know things through reason that wouldn't be possible to know through observation alone. Rationalists will often appeal to mathematics as the kind of obvious case of something that we know that doesn't rely on observation. Empiricists, however, on the other hand, tend to push back, claiming that math and other a priori knowledge isn't really knowledge at all. It's just sort of how we've set things up, or part of the way our language works, part of our conceptual scheme, part of the way that we organize the world. Basically, an empiricist will tend to think that statements like 1 plus 2 equals 3, or every event has a cause, are true because they are analytic statements, true in virtue of the way that we have set up our language, rather than being true because they reflect some deep facts that we have some magical rational access to about the nature of reality. Now, when it comes to the kinds of knowledge that we have, empiricists tend to believe in nurture versus nature. They tend to believe in what's called tabula rasa, which is the idea that when we're born a blank slate. And as we develop, we come to learn things, we come to know things as they impinge upon us. We are taught things by our parents and by the world, and then come to know those things. Rationalists, on the other hand, tend to believe in nature versus nurture, where they tend to think that no, there are some things that we actually start in a way knowing from the get-go. We're born with a certain ingrained set of knowledge, and then that knowledge is coaxed out or developed in certain ways as we grow. Now, when it comes to this battle, ultimately in philosophy, the rationalists have kind of won because science has shown that there are certain things that we have sort of genetically ingrained into us, certain ways of knowing how to do things. Take, for example, like certain species of birds that come out of their eggs automatically knowing how to build a nest without ever being taught or shown. These kinds of things, if that's ultimately what the rationalists are on about, then rationalism wins. But it's worth recognizing that we shouldn't count empiricism out. It's just that, empiricism has to take a longer form view and rely on a certain kind of understanding of the relationship between what it is that we know and how evolution works. So now it seems like we know a lot of things, and we have a lot of methods for knowing things. But are we really sure that we know these things? How do we know that we know things? Now, it seems like I know where I am right now, right? I'm currently in Santa Barbara. And if this is true, then it's going to follow that I know a bunch of other things, like that my attached left foot is in Santa Barbara because I'm not missing a foot. That I'm inside of the United States, right? Because California is inside of the United States and Santa Barbara is inside of California. And that I'm on the West Coast because California is on the West Coast, Santa Barbara is on the West Coast as well. But it would seem that there's something that I don't know. I don't know that I'm not a brain that has been transplanted out of this body while I was sleeping into a vat and hooked up to a special computer with a VR system in just the right way, where it's causing the electrical impulses to create this artificial reality that's causing my experiences right now, where it seems to me as everything would normally seem to me. There's no way that I don't know, or, that I'm not that brain, right? I mean, of course, it would seem to me in just the same ways, right, that I'm still in Santa Barbara, that I'm still in California, that I have my attached left foot, even if I were this brain in a vat situation. So this is going to be an issue. It seems like I can't possibly know that this sort of situation hasn't happened to me. Now, this creates a rather big problem, because if I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, then how in the world do I know that I'm in Santa Barbara? Like we said earlier, I know I'm in Santa Barbara, right? I mean, it's obvious, it's clear as day. Think about wherever you are. You know that you're there, right? But if I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, and being a brain in a vat would require me to not be in Santa Barbara. I don't think that they have that technology here. Then how is it possible for me to really know that I'm in Santa Barbara? Take this classic example. Look at your hand and think, this is my hand. Now think about the possibility of being a brain in a vat. If you were a brain in a vat, then you wouldn't have any hands. So now look again at your hand and think, if I'm a brain in a vat, then this isn't a hand. If anything, it's a computer simulation that's causing me to believe that this is a hand. But whatever it is, it's not a hand, given the thought that I'm a brain in a vat that's having this simulated experience. So now, if I don't know that I'm not in a computer simulation right now, do I really know that this thing in front of me is a hand? This brings us to a classical skeptical argument. If I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, then I don't know that this thing in front of me is a hand. I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, and so therefore I don't know that this is a hand. This is a classic modus ponens style inference to the conclusion that ultimately I don't know that this is a hand, and you can basically do this argument with almost anything that you want to plug in for the proposition that this is a hand, thereby, coming to a rather daunting skeptical conclusion that if you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, all kinds of things are, you don't know all kinds of things. Here's how the argument generalizes. If I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, then I don't know that P, where P can be any proposition that you want. And given that you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, it ultimately is going to be that you don't know that P. So anything that is precluded from being known, given that you don't know you're not a brain in a vat, so things like where you are, your body, what clothes you're wearing, who you talked to last, whether or not you ate breakfast, all of these things that can go in for P are going to ultimately be things that you, on the basis of this argument, don't know. So I'll leave you with this. What do you think you know? Do you know anything beyond a shadow of a doubt? Are there other ways, maybe, that you could come to know that this is your hand, or maybe some mathematical truth? And is it really the case that simply because you don't know you're not a brain in a vat, that you don't know that you're not in Santa Barbara, or that you don't know that you have hands? This is the problem of skepticism, and what we'll be discussing next.